Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer lore. Today we are visiting once again the Mountains of Morn and the Ogre Kingdoms, as we will be speaking of a very peculiar type of ogre, generally known as man-eaters. A somewhat misleading name, actually, since their main source of fame, quote-unquote, does not necessarily come from the act of eating people. Instead, it references the fact that these are ogres that have wandered out of the mountains and into the lands of the lesser races, where they have sold themselves as exceedingly violent and brutish wrecking balls that can be thrown at the enemy with great abandon. In other words, mercenaries. Not a particularly unusual vocation for ogres, and one that they are well and truly suited to, considering the fact that they are giant, violent monstrosities that like to eat their enemies. And if you don't have any enemies, well, how are you going to acquire dinner? As such, the life of a mercenary is perfectly suited to an ogre, as both enemies and dinner are regularly served in exactly the same fashion, and when either one or the other is lacking, the mercenary lifestyle will take care of the problem, either by preparing dinner in the form of monetary compensation, which will purchase dinner, or by preparing dinner in the form of enemies. It is undoubtedly what you would refer to as a win-win situation, and hell, even the people who employ the ogre will reap the benefits in the form of having a giant pile of violent flesh on his side in the next battle. But of course, a line must be drawn, because not all ogre mercenaries are man-eaters, and not all man-eaters are mercenaries. That might seem a little bit of a contradictory term, considering that, well, all man-eaters have at some point been mercenaries. However, they can of course return back home and now be in the service of some ogre tyrant or another. If anything, the crucial distinguishing factor could perhaps be said to be experience. Whilst quite a few ogres decide to wander out of their mountain homelands to try their luck in the lands of the squishy people for a while, many of them decide that, well, this is a boring-ass place, the people squish far too easily, and they give you these funny looks when you begin eating the corpses. It is, in other words, a silly place. And therefore, they will return home. However, some man-eaters take a shine to the land of the squishies, and will even go so far as to adopt their customs, with one example. No ogre will ever give up his gut plate. That is the one thing that an ogre will always have, because protecting one's gut is far more important than quite literally anything else. But, of course, the word gutplate is a remarkably flexible term. As long as it is a large, solid piece of whatever, preferably metal, that can be draped across the said ogre's gut region, then it is a gutplate. And as such, many ogres that wish to blend into civilized society might, for example, replace the giant hunking piece of bronze they are so fond of with, say, a shield, for example. They will also make various other efforts to try and blend into civilized society, as much as a hulking monstrosity that is 2 to 3 times as large as anything around it can actually blend into anything, but hey, minor fucking details. For example, an ogre that finds itself in the Empire might get himself a pair of smashing flared breeches and a wonderful multicolored blouse, if he can somehow find one that fits, or alternatively, he will simply just take a tent and wear that instead. It's multicolored and, well, it fits if nothing else. Or perhaps one finds itself in Araby and adopts a stylish turban. Or what about a lovely little captain's hat, complete with a parrot, or, well, a Gnoblar dressed up in feathers to be precise, but close enough. Or perhaps one simply wanders into a kitchen somewhere and comes out looking like this. Ugh. But of course, the style of dress is not the only thing that the Ogre Maneater will culturally appropriate from its host nation. Wherever plausible, they will also copy the styles of warfare available in that nation. For example, let us say that one is fighting with a group of Empire mercenaries exceedingly fond of long, pokey objects, frequently referred to as pikes. For example, Rico's Republican Guards. The ogre would try to mimic their way of fighting by getting himself his own pike. In all due likelihood, an ogre pike would be more along the lines of a sharpened tree trunk, but the principle is much the same. Now, of course, a lot of these weapons might not be particularly fitting for the ogre way of war. For example, again, in the case of a pike. The primary strength of a pike block is the fact that you have a large number of sharp-pointed objects presented in uniformity and unity towards the enemy, meaning that anyone that wants to get to the soft squishy people behind the sharp pointy objects will have to fight their way through several serried rank of stabbing things that wants to skewer their innards. The downside, of course, is that a pike block requires discipline and regimentation and an absolute fuckton of it. It requires a lot of training, a lot of practice, and a lot of drill to operate a pike block effectively, even during parade ground circumstances. Once crossbow bolts and angry people with giant two-handed swords are flying towards you, it is considerably more difficult to keep everyone focused on not running away while pissing their pants, and even more difficult to keep them in a regimented formation and holding their ground, regardless of how close the enemy and said two-handed sword comes. And whilst of course the ogre himself is not particularly likely to run away screaming while watering the local flowers with his freshly squeezed urine, he is however exceedingly likely to take matters into his own hands. Ogres are not particularly fond of fighting in formations at the best of times, and they are certainly not particularly fond of keeping the enemy at an arm's length. The likely scenario in this case would be that the ogre decides that he can do a much better job than the small pink humans in front of him and simply push through the pike block and start laying about him with the pike, using it more along the lines of a club rather than an actually pokey stick. But of course, it is not impossible. Ogres are not stupid, or, well, they kind of are, but they're not utterly retarded. With the lengthy training, practice, and frequent rewards, you could potentially get an ogre to understand the value of staying in formation. I personally would not be betting my ass on the odds of that ever happening, but you certainly could try. An Ogre Maneater would be far better off if he gets into an area with a little bit more variety and weaponry. For example, let's say that he joins up with a unit of just random mercenaries, a group of people armed with whatever they can get their hands on, instead of a heavily regimented formation like Rico's Republican Guards. In that case, the ogre might be free to get himself a giant fuck-off sword, for example. Or just a huge hunk of metal. It doesn't really matter when it's driven by the muscles of an ogre. Or perhaps simply just a very large and exceedingly heavy object, like a giant cudgel, perhaps reinforced with a few bands of iron. Or again, perhaps just simply a huge hunk of metal. It doesn't even have to pretend to be a sword. A ship's anchor, for example, would serve an ogre perfectly well as a melee weapon because it possesses the only two qualities that an ogre weapon actually requires. It is exceedingly heavy and, thusly, exceedingly unlikely to break when the ogre swings it at something. And lest we forget, ogres are remarkably large and strong, as such they require a fairly sturdy bludgeoning tool. Luckily for the ogres, they are capable of picking up things that would be sturdy enough to be swung about with fairly wild abandon, without any real fear of it shattering, seeing as breaking your weapon in a battle is generally speaking a bad idea. And also, on the subject of weaponry, because there is one rather interesting little caveat here. So, pretty much all normal, quote-unquote, ogres do not really have access to anything in the way of ranged weaponry. In fact, the only ones that utilize ranged weaponry to any real extent are considered to be outcasts and ruffians and crazy people in ogre society. Like, for example, the lone hunters that will use what is essentially a gigantic harpoon thrower. Or the lead belchers, who are literally carrying around on cannons and are generally considered by ogre society, and justifiably so by the way, to be crazier than a bag full of harmoniously stimulated ferrets. And despite this rather obvious stigma that they carry with them from their homeland, Ogre Maneaters will actually, relatively speaking, frequently use ranged weapons. For example, the ones in the Empire will use handguns, or, well, blunderbusses to normal humans, but to an ogre, it's essentially a handgun. Or perhaps they will utilize some form of throwing weapon. For example, say one got stuck in Nippon for an extended period of time and decided to become a ninja. It seems a bit counterintuitive considering the sheer size and relatively unsneaky nature of your average ogre, but hey, fucking details, and we shall not be body-shaming anyone here. More than we already have, anyways. And to be entirely honest, that last example is probably the most strange one. Okay, teaching an ogre how to operate a blunderbuss would be fiddly enough in and of itself, and almost certainly the ogre would require a Gnoblar specially trained to the task, as well. Even though I just said I wouldn't be body-shaming anybody, the giant sausage-ass pudgy fingers of an ogre is going to be exceptionally unsuited to the relatively delicate task of reloading a black powder weapon. And considering how difficult that relatively simple task would be, I cannot for the life of me imagine an ogre utilizing shurikens with any kind of dexterity. On the other hand, the ogre might simply decide that these small shurikens are not fitting for his purpose, and rightfully so, and simply start hurling shields, for example, at people. It's much the same principle again, just a slightly different size. But despite all of this, Ogre Maneaters usually manage to adopt their new weapons and following fighting style surprisingly well, everything considered. After all, you would think that a giant and not particularly intelligent lump of a creature, desperately trying to find any way whatsoever he could possibly fight with weapons that are at the very least vaguely similar to those used by his far smaller and exceedingly different companions, would turn out to be kinda shit at utilizing said weapons. After all, most weapons that are designed for considerably smaller creatures are unlikely to perform quite as well once they are utilized by a thing that is several times the size of the weapon's originally intended user. However, the ogres overcome this inconvenient truth via the application of unremitting and increasingly large amounts of sheer brute force. Whilst a sword might require a certain degree of finesse to be used effectively, if a sword is large enough to essentially just be a giant hunk of metal, a lot of said finesse is no longer required. Whilst a sword might, for example, be required to be thrust into the openings between an enemy's armor plating to actually do any damage, if you simply scale up the weapon to 17 times the size and/or weight, frankly, you are no longer required to sneak the weapon in between plates of armor. You can simply just buckle the armor entirely. And whilst, of course, Ogre Maneaters will display a far greater degree of finesse than their more savage brethren, everything is, of course, relative. Though, said increase in finesse and just general thinking, not to mention of course the fact that they will have learned a whole lot of brand new and interesting stuff from their adopted homeland, Ogre Maneaters that return back home are highly valued by Ogre Tyrants. Not only are they likely to be the best technical fighters in their entire army, perhaps with the potential caveat of the Iron Guts themselves, they are, of course, much better than most ogres. And they are considerably cleverer. They might actually have learned some form of strategy from their former employers. While most ogres will simply just run screaming towards the enemy, hoping that their sheer mass, velocity, and strength will win them the battle, and frequently that is indeed the case, Ogre Maneaters might employ slightly more finesse in solving various battlefield puzzles. For example, they might even go so far as to employ an esoterical tactic known as flanking, whereupon the ogres will move slightly to the right or left of an enemy formation and attempt to hit them from the sides. It is a hard concept to entirely understand, I grant you, but it has proven to be remarkably effective on several occasions. Of course, sometimes the ogres do not quite understand the more nuanced elements of said tactics. For example, in the case of this flanking thing, they might fail to understand that when they move to the left, the enemy formation might also decide to tilt to the left, turning the flanking maneuver into just another head-on charge. What they fail, of course, to realize is that you're going to need some kind of threat to the front of the enemy to keep them in position. But hey, minor and relatively insignificant details. It is, of course, after all, the thought that counts. And to be entirely fair, it is not always that an Ogre Maneater will bring back such a complex and detailed stratagem. He might simply bring back some form of, refinement on already existing ogre battle plans. An ogre might, for example, have served with a tribe of orcs, who share much in the way of tactical and strategic similarities with their ogre brethren. However, a charge might be made further effective by screaming "Warg" at the top of their lungs before impacting upon the enemy. Or, additional protection from enemy long-range firepower might be acquired by smearing various substitutes, for example, cow cum, all over one's body. This, of course, has magical properties and will cause incoming cannonballs to swerve away from the ogre and hit somebody else. Of course, it is entirely possible that said somebody might also have covered their entire body in bluish cow cum, however, they clearly did not do it correctly, which is why the cannonball hit them instead of you. There is, though, as always, a downside. You see, having these geniuses and innovators amongst a tribe will bring with it a large number of really annoyed ogres, because of course the newfound Maneater will not stop bothering everyone fucking else all the goddamn time about his various exploit in the greater world beyond. And whilst most ogres might consider his tales to be fascinating at first, after 666 retellings or so, they tend to become infuriatingly grating. And were it not for the Maneater's skill at arms, he would almost certainly find himself accidented to death sometime during the dark of night, perhaps while he is returning from the brick shithouse. Perhaps, for example, he would be unlucky enough to slip and fall upon a cleaver, for example, 666 times. The number seems oddly specific, but there's probably a connection there somewhere. But enough about the ogres themselves, because I feel like we also need to give a moment of the spotlight to the unsung heroes of the Maneaters. Namely, of course, the Gnoblars. Because an ogre will usually bring with him a few favoured Gnoblars. These beloved pets will travel with their masters and aid them in any way they can by, for example, reloading black powder weapons or posing as a parrot. That last one seems oddly specific once again, but, well, we know that to be the case, so I'm just bringing it up. Once these brave companions are brought back home to the Mountains of Morn, their status will of course be elevated far above those of the normal Gnoblars, because of course said Gnoblar will have survived countless engagements that his master has fought in, of a wide, varied, and frequent nature, and perhaps even more impressive, the Gnoblar has not been eaten by his master while said master was in between employers, and an ogre can get very, very hungry. And on that cheery note, I shall bid you adieu. I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.